All right, guys. So Israel killed a Palestinian journalist in the West Bank. I'm going to show you this video on it, and we'll talk about it as we go here. By the way, this is from Mac, good politic guy. Go subscribe to him on YouTube because he's a great YouTuber and commentator, and he just unfortunately has gotten in the game way too late, and the algorithm absolutely obliterates him. If he was doing this content back in like 2014, he would have 250,000 subscribers by now. But the algorithm just snuffs out independent and new media people, and so he gets screwed. But you're about to see he does really quality stuff, so let's let him educate us on what happened here. And we'll
All right, so early this morning, we got some news that the Israeli military has killed an Al Jazeera journalist in the occupied West Bank. Her name is Shireen Abu Akleh, and she was in the middle of trying to cover a raid that the Israeli military was doing on a refugee camp within Jenin in the occupied West Bank. So there's a couple different angles that I wanted to get to on this story. Obviously, it's horrific and tragic, but at the same time, unfortunately, is not too out of the ordinary for the violence that Palestinians are subjected to on a daily basis by the state of Israel. So a couple different angles I want to get into. Obviously, who she was as a journalist, the details surrounding this murder from the Israeli security forces, as well as getting into debunking some of the narratives that have been pushed by the Israeli government in response to this entire thing, some of the lies that they have been telling, and as well some of the coverage from the mainstream media, which is doing what they do best, and that is acting like they are neutral while they are actually defending the state of Israel as they are continuing to conduct war crimes like this murder that we're seeing here. So from Al Jazeera themselves, they say Shireen Abu Akleh, Al Jazeera reporter, killed by Israeli gunfire. Israeli forces shot Abu Akleh in the head while she was on assignment in Jenin in the occupied West Bank. So a little bit of details here. They say Israeli forces have shot dead Al Jazeera's journalist Shireen Abu Akleh in the occupied West Bank, according to the Palestinian Health Ministry, and she was a longtime TV correspondent for Al Jazeera Arabic and was killed on Wednesday while covering Israeli army raids in the city of Jenin in the northern occupied West Bank. And they say Abu Akleh was wearing a press vest and was standing with other journalists when she was killed, and I saw the video surrounding this entire incident. Obviously, I can't show you guys that, but yeah, they were clearly identified.
Thank you, YouTube Terms of Service. I mean, look, I get that one. I sort of understand that one. Like, actual crimes being shown is categorically different than just a free speech issue. But, yeah, I mean, at least it does sort of shake people out of their complacency when they see what's actually going on.
As journalists, they were wearing the flak jackets and the helmet, both labeled with press, and also according to the eyewitness testimony of the other journalists who were involved and saw all of this unfold, there were no Palestinian militants that were even within the area, which is going to be important as we tie back to some of the narratives that have been pushed by the state of Israel. And
think about that. Wearing the big press jacket, no Palestinian militants around, and she gets gunned down by Israel. And then you're going to see how they obfuscate massively and just lie about what happened.
In this story as is breaking right now, but they continue here saying another Al Jazeera journalist, Ali Al-Samoudi, was also wounded by a bullet in the back at the scene, and he is now fortunately in stable conditions. A little bit more details here. They say that Al-Samoudi and other journalists at the scene said that there were no Palestinian fighters present when the journalists were shot, directly disputing an Israeli statement referencing the possibility that it was Palestinian fire. And he says, quote, "We were going to film the Israeli army operation and suddenly they shot us without asking us to leave or to stop filming." And he said the first bullet hit me and the second bullet hit Shireen. There was no Palestinian military resistance at all at the scene. And Shatha Hanaisha, a local journalist who was standing next to Abu Akleh when she was shot, also told Al Jazeera that there had been no confrontations between Palestinian fighters and the Israeli army. She said the group of journalists had been directly targeted, and she said, quote, "We were 4 journalists, we were all wearing vests, all wearing helmets," she said, and the Israeli occupation army did not stop firing even after she had collapsed. I couldn't even extend my arm to pull her because of the shots that were being fired, and the army was adamant on shooting to kill.
So it's cold-blooded murder is what it is. And it's terrorism. That's what it is. So I want to plug right now, Abby Martin did a phenomenal documentary on Gaza. I think it's called Gaza's Fight for Freedom, something like that. Sorry, Abby, if I'm butchering that. Just look up Abby Martin Gaza documentary. And she really covers what's been going on there and what Israel is engaged in. And I hate to say it because it sounds so callous, but like this is sort of par for the course with what the IDF does. They commit brazen acts of terrorism and murder, and then like go into total obfuscation and deflection mode and act like, no, it was like a legitimate target, or we didn't even do that, or just flat out lies. And it's truly astonishing. They're not fooling anybody. Well, actually, no, I stand corrected. They are fooling one group of people. The U.S. media. And you're going to see how they deflect and they fall back on, like, both sidisms, and they use, like, passive language when describing just the outright cold-blooded murder and terrorism that's committed. It truly is astonishing.
And a little bit more details on who she was. They say Abu Akleh was a dual Palestinian-American national, was one of Al Jazeera's first field correspondents, joining the network in 1997, and Palestinian MP Khalida Jarrar said Abu Akleh was the voice of Palestinians and was killed by the monstrosity of Israeli colonialism and occupation. And they say Shireen was our voice. It is unbelievable. It is a crime. It is all clear, intentional, and direct targeting. She was targeted. It's clear. And I think that that's pretty obvious once you get to the actual evidence surrounding this. There's absolutely no way, in my opinion at least, that these fighters, this Israeli sniper that ended up killing her and shooting this other man, there's basically no way, according to the evidence, according to what was happening at the ground at the time, that they wouldn't have known that these were journalists, and that maybe even they wouldn't have known specifically who these journalists were, who have been
that's an interesting point. So we know for sure they know they were journalists, but perhaps they knew exactly who she was and exactly what her perspective was. And so you want to talk about authoritarianism, you want to talk about a crackdown on free speech and a free press. Well, this is 101 textbook type stuff on that front, because you murder her in cold blood and you send a message to any other reporters who are sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. You send a clear message. Hey, fuck around and find out. Careful with what you're saying about the IDF. Careful with how you, portray the conflict.
Prominent veteran reporters in covering the crimes that are regularly committed by Israel. But they continue here saying all the witnesses present at the scene of the crime ensures that it was an Israeli sniper that committed the crime in a deliberate way. And here we get to the Israeli military line. They say the Israeli military said its soldiers had come under attack with heavy gunfire and explosives while operating in Jenin, and that they had fired back. And it added that it was investigating the event. I'm sure that they're going to do an impartial investigation into this, but they say Al Jazeera's offices in the Gaza Strip.
The Israeli military is going to do, they're going to do a fair investigation. By the way, U.S. State Department ghoul Ned Price, who looks like he wakes up and steps out of a coffin every morning, he said, well, yeah, we have faith that they're going to do an impartial investigation. The IDF is going to investigate their own murder in an impartial way, according to the United States. Man, oh, God, it's so infuriating.
In a building that also housed the Associated Press were bombed by Israeli forces during an offensive a year ago.
Right, so by the way, anybody who's questioning, how true this narrative is or whatever, remember that they bombed the AP building on video. They leveled it. So this is again, this is par for the course when we're talking about Israeli crimes.
And Palestinian and international journalists say that they have been regularly targeted by Israeli forces in the occupied West Bank and in occupied East Jerusalem. So, again, it's not something that's too out of the ordinary, even given how horrific this specific incident actually is. It's not out of the ordinary, and of course we know that the Israeli security forces have absolutely no problem whatsoever targeting Palestinian journalists or even targeting Israeli or American outlets that are operating within, for example, the Gaza Strip, where we saw last year the AP building get bombed into oblivion with basically no justification provided with evidence by the Israeli military as to why they bombed the AP building as well as Al Jazeera's office. So again, targeting journalists, not exactly something that is out of the ordinary for the Israeli military forces, but now we get to some of the official lines. So the narrative that has basically been pushed by the Israeli military in this is that, well, there's no real clear way to know who fired the shot that ended up killing Shireen. It could have been Israeli fighters. Well, really, they're not even admitting that. They're really just trying to suggest that it was actually Palestinian resistance fighters who ended up shooting and killing her. Now, they didn't provide any evidence whatsoever or any substantive evidence. We're going to get to what they have provided, but before we get into the lines that have been pushed by the Israeli government and by the U.S. media in this circumstance, B'Tselem, which is a fantastic outlet that basically does reporting on human rights in the occupied territories, as you can see there, great reputable outlet for something like this, and they basically did a full on-the-ground investigative report where they were going to the locations of where Palestinian militants were located, where the Israeli snipers were located, as well as where the journalists were located in this situation, and essentially, as you can see, and again, I'll always link all of this down below for you guys to go and check out for yourself, but as you can see here from the mapping of this, it literally did not make sense according to the line of fire that it could have possibly been. the Palestinian resistance fighters who ended up killing this journalist and shooting the other one, it literally would not have been physically possible for the claim that is being made by the Israeli military right now to be valid. So according to all of the evidence on the ground, it was in fact an Israeli sniper that killed her. And again, according to the eyewitness testimony, there were no Palestinian militants that were in the region or in the area that they were. So there's absolutely no justification that you could possibly give for shooting, let alone killing this journalist, as well as shooting another one. So now we get to how the U.S. media is covering this. And listen, they're covering this as you would expect, as they have always covered Palestinian-Israeli issues like this. I mean, even if you want to go back to when the AP building was bombed into oblivion by Israel, even the AP themselves were reporting all of this in like somewhat neutral language, right? Pretending as if, oh, well, you know, they could have potentially had some justification for doing this. Maybe they thought Hamas was operating in the building, even though they never provided any evidence whatsoever.
I remember that, and I remember how triggered it made me. I mean, that's massively cooked. You get your building gets bombed to smithereens by Israel. Well, maybe they thought like there were weapons in here, or like Hamas had taken it over or something.
For that claim, and they're doing the exact same thing that they do when outlets like the New York Times report on police brutality or police murders here domestically within the United States, you know, using the Israeli military or using police officers as if they're legitimate sources and should just be trusted at face value without any substantive evidence to back up their claims. They do a little bit of that here, as well as using some neutral language. But here from the New York Times, they say Al Jazeera journalist is killed in the West Bank, conveniently leaving out who killed her, according to all of the evidence that we have. And they say the network and Palestinian authorities blamed Israeli troops for the killing, and Israel said the blame could lie with Palestinian gunmen. So again, notice how they put in the literal subheader here.
This is pathetic, man. It's so pathetic. Oh my god. Oh my god. Look, what I usually do is when I'm dealing with a lot of foreign policy topics is I will actively look for non-US sources. Now, you do have to be careful though, because, you know, so like one of the claims that they're making is that, well, Al Jazeera is reporting this in a very biased way because Al Jazeera is the government of Qatar, you know, funds Al Jazeera, and the government of Qatar has links to like Hamas, so they're giving the pro-Palestinian side, but they're biasing it. When you look at the evidence objectively, it's very clear that the way they're describing this unfolded is way more closer to correct than the way Israel is trying to obfuscate and deflect on the situation. But generally what I try to do when talking about foreign policy topics is I think there's like a couple French outlets that do a decent job. There's a German outlet, I think DW News, that does a decent job. So basically anything that gets you a few steps removed from US corporate media is going to do a much better job. Now, still, you always have to, you know, look with skepticism, look for hints of bias here or there, right? And try to determine what's accurate to the best of your ability by almost looking at all the different sources and then piecing together what's the most likely thing that happens. But when you look at how US media covers this sort of shit, it's like embarrassingly terrible. And like on its face, it's absurd and preposterous and ridiculous. Like, look at this stuff. Look at this, man. New York Times. What are you doing? What are you doing?
That, oh, well, I guess it's up in the air. And these two claims, the one being made by the eyewitness testimony from people who were there during this incident, the claims that have been made by outlets like B'Tselem, proving definitively that it wouldn't even physically be possible for it to be anybody other than the Israeli military who ended up shooting her, they still present this as if these are two equal claims. Oh, well, you know, the Palestinians are saying one thing and the Israelis are saying another thing, so I guess there's just no way to really know what happened here. No, that's completely disingenuous and it's complete bullshit, and it's really just a pathetic excuse for journalism, but this is how they framed it. Now, I wanted to show you exactly what the actual claims here from the Israeli military are, so you can know how bullshit they really are here. So they say the Israeli military said in a statement that its forces had been in Jenin to arrest suspects and it came under fire first. And they say, quote, massive fire was shot toward Israeli security forces by tens of armed Palestinian gunmen, the military said, adding that they also hurled explosive devices towards the soldiers, endangering their lives. And the soldiers responded with fire toward the sources of the fire and the explosion devices. Hits were identified. So yeah, there were clashes, as they like to call them here, between Israeli security forces and Palestinian resistance fighters, but those were not the Palestinian resistance fighters, or those resistance fighters were not located in the same spot as the journalists. So even if
amazing, so disingenuous. It's like what we talked about the other day, and I don't know if it was released on the channel yet. It'll probably be released today on the channel, where you have people on the right in the U.S. trying to conflate the peaceful protests in front of the Supreme Court justices' houses. People trying to conflate that with like a pipe bomb on a pro-life clinic. They just like try to mesh those two things together and act like, well, if you defend one thing, you're defending the other thing. Whoa, 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 whoa. Those are two totally separate things. So why are you talking about this in the context of a reporter being murdered in cold blood by the IDF?
You were fired upon, it wasn't by these journalists. That's completely disingenuous to conflate these two things as if they're directly connected. But they say in a separate statement, the Israeli Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, said that Israeli security forces had returned fire as accurately and carefully and responsibly as possible. I'm sure
Come on, bro. Come on, man.
that they did, and that there is a significant possibility that the journalist was shot by the armed Palestinians. Now, again, this is not backed up by any evidence whatsoever, but here's what they're trying to claim. They say Mr. Bennett's office circulated a video, first broadcast by Al Jazeera on Wednesday morning, that showed Palestinian gunmen in a different part of Jenin, firing down an alley, and a voice saying in Arabic, they've hit one, they've hit a soldier, he's lying on the ground. So basically what they're trying to say is, you had Palestinian resistance fighters who were generally located within Jenin. They weren't near the actual journalists in question here, but they were generally within the region, and those fighters claimed that they had hit an Israeli soldier. Now, the Israelis are saying, no, they didn't hit a soldier, so maybe the person that they thought that they had hit had actually been the journalist. Now, again, we've already seen, according to the breakdowns and the evidence on the ground, that that is not the case, and it's much more likely that, these fighters either didn't actually kill somebody or they thought they shot somebody and they didn't, but there's no evidence whatsoever that this firing of whoever they thought they hit in this instance was the journalist, Shaneen Abu Akler, but there's no evidence whatsoever for that claim. But they continue saying, since no Israeli soldiers were reported killed on Wednesday, Mr. Bennett's office said that the video suggests that Palestinian terrorists were the ones who shot the journalists. And they say, however, an Israeli rights group, B'Tselem, as we just saw there in that tweet thread, released a map of the location where Mrs. Abu Akla was killed, which it said was several hundred yards from where the video circulated by the Prime Minister's office had been filmed. So not even close to the location that we're talking about here. And they say Mr. Samudi, who was also there, said that there were no clashes taking place where he and Mrs. Abu Akla were hit and that they were shot by Israeli soldiers. So again, you see the contradiction here of them portraying these as if they're two equal things, right? You have the Israeli military, the Prime Minister of Israel, Naftali Bennett, who are coming out and making a claim that provides absolutely no evidence to back it up whatsoever. And the one piece of evidence that they do provide, which has nothing to do with the journalists and where they were, is completely refuted by the actual testimony of people who were there and the evidence of where these gunshots were taking place. So they're just fucking lying, and yet still, basically the entirety of the mainstream press here domestically within the United States that I've seen cover this is pushing the same type of neutral language and pushing this as if it's, up in the air who's responsible for this killing, when again, the evidence is overwhelming that it was very clearly Israeli snipers who conducted this murder and that they in fact did it intentionally. But again, this isn't anything out of the ordinary. This is just a part of this ongoing violent apartheid and ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, the violence that they are subjected to on a regular basis. So it is horrific, it is tragic, but at the same time, unfortunately, this is what's going to continue happening if there is no accountability. If the US media isn't willing to come out and describe these events as accurately as they possibly can, or really just being completely disingenuous, again, in a similar way to how they cover police here in the United States, where, they'll use this neutral rhetoric and use the passive voice and...
That is true. That is true. They won't say, like, officer shoots unarmed man. They use passive language. Like, unarmed man shot in whatever. Fill in the blank. Unarmed man shot in, I want to say tussle. Tussle? Is that a word? Unarmed man shot in back and forth with officer or something. Like, they always do try to phrase it in a way that seeps agency, accountability, and responsibility away from where it belongs.
Pretend as if the two sides are equally valid, even though all of the evidence is indicating that one party is responsible, in this case, the party being Israel. So completely irresponsible from the media, but no accountability is going to come from this. If you have a United States that is dumping $3.8 or more billion into Israel completely unquestionably, as they continue their apartheid, as they continue to raid these refugee settlements, as they continue to illegally expand into the West Bank, all of these things, there's never going to be any accountability unless we force the US government to apply pressure and, I don't know, maybe condition aid to Israel on them not being an apartheid state, on them, not willfully executing journalists in the way that they've clearly done here. So, unfortunately, again, probably not going to be any accountability from this, but that's why it's more important than ever that you talk about this, that you cover this, that you make it very clear exactly what's happening on the ground, so that at least there's some semblance of attention that is given to this, and the mainstream narratives that are being pushed forward by the US media and by the state of Israel themselves can be definitively refuted.
Okay, so again, big shout out to Good Politic Guy. Everybody go subscribe to him on Twitter. Give him a like on the video. I mean, this is phenomenal work, and it's got 229 views, and it's not his fault. It's the fault of the algorithm. They bury this stuff completely. They bury it. I'm sure if you type in Israel journalist shooting or killing or whatever, you're going to get all, CNN, ABC, CBS, like the big boys, whoever covered it. And of course, when you go to those outlets, it'll all be the neutral language and like the who knows what really happened. So this is actual good work, and it's totally hidden and buried by the algorithm, and it's total bullshit. So everybody go subscribe to Good Politic Guy. He did a fantastic job covering this, and his whole channel's like this too. By the way, he covers straight bangers all the time. In fact, here I'll give him a little more detailed shout out here. Let's go to videos. Okay. Ron DeSantis mandates victims of communism school propaganda. Biden breaks campaign pledge and betrays Amazon union. The video we just watched. Trump wanted to bomb Mexico to fight drug cartels. Nancy Pelosi calls for a strong Republican Party. Jordan Peterson cries over climate change activists. Biden pushes civility as protests erupt at SCOTUS member's house. McConnell says GOP may push federal ban on abortions. So what I like about him is that he does what I try to do, which is give people like an accurate portrayal of how U.S. politics is with his story selection. He's going after corporate Democrats. He's going after Republicans. He's covering like super substantive stuff. So anyway, big shout out to Good Politic Guy, also known as Mac on Twitter. So everybody go subscribe to him. And man, that story about Israel murdering the journalist in cold blood and then obfuscating and deflecting. Oh, I mean, I wouldn't expect anything different, but it still is just gut-wrenching and heartbreaking, and it makes my blood boil.